the GS's command to us, instruction to us to win back time. So comments, today's Jack Simons Party School is on a very valid and very topical topic. And obviously we're going to be addressed by our first Deputy General Secretary, Comrade Solly, on the role of SOEs in the development path. Today, of course, is also Women's Day, South Africans Women's Day. So salute to all the women in our party, to all progressive women in our country, and to the women's struggle in general, the struggle against patriarchy, which is a struggle against capitalism, not just capitalism, but it's also fundamentally the struggle against capitalism. I thought since we are the Jack Simons Party School, I would tell one anecdote about Comrade Jack Simons, which is relevant to this day. Now, Jack, as comrades know, was married to Comrade Ray Alexander, who was a tireless organizer and worker, trade unionist and so on, who came to the country, Jenny, when? At the age of 16 or 17, I think.
Yeah.
From, something
15,
like that,
16, something like
and
that,
arrived
yeah.
on a boat as a sort of basically a refugee from pogroms in Eastern Europe, arrived at Cape Town docks and immediately began to organize as a 16-year-old the dock workers in the harbor. But the story I want to tell about Jack Simons is that, so Comrade Ray was basically founded and set up and ran for many, many years amongst many unions. The key one was the Food and Canning Workers Union. And so she couldn't drive, but she needed to go out to all of those Boerland canning towns, Montague and Ashton and Worcester and Wellington and Paarl and so forth. And so who drove her? The famous academic Jack Simons, who would drive out in a little old car of the 1930s and 40s, and then sit there outside the meeting, not going into it, for many hours at a time. And we all know how long trade union meetings can last. And then would lovingly take Comrade Ray back home again. So the struggle against patriarchy and the struggle to ensure that women are able to play their full role in the struggle, which was certainly something that Ray Alexander always claimed and did, was also facilitated, in this case, social reproduction, Comrade Jenny, in this case by Comrade Jack Simons. So let's honor his memory in many ways, including the huge supportive role he played, the sort of role that women normally are expected to play, that he played for his, as an activist himself, but for his activist wife. Comrade Solly, over to you. And thanks very much for making yourself available for this very vital topic. Comrade Solly.
Thank you very much, Comrade JC, and greetings to all our comrades, especially Comrade Jeremy, a stalwart of our party, and former leading official, intellectual of our party. I think it's important to say I appreciate your opening comments, particularly on Women's Day. And we had a big debate with our comrades in the office whether we should do this lecture today on SOEs, or we should have a topic focused on the women's question or the gender question. And I couldn't win that debate, Comrade Jeremy. So I was defeated by the democratic dictatorship to say we must proceed and integrate the women's question, the gender question, in the economic questions. Of course, they're not unrelated. Firstly is to greet all comrades, but also start by saying we share some few moments of tribute to some of our comrades that have passed on. Comrade John Kadiman was one of our most humble patriots of our revolution. Together with some of his own namesake, John Lewis from the US human rights movement, civil rights movement, as well as Corrie Tyndall, Vivian, was one of the stalwarts of that human rights movement. And these comrades supported our movement strongly during the days when we were in exile and particularly in assisting the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. But also to pay tribute to our Deputy Provincial Chairperson in the Free State Province, Comrade Mbuyiselo Jacobs, who was buried yesterday. And Dr. Monde, one of our communist activists and doctors who provided free medical services to most of our comrades and our stalwarts who passed on during the week. He was one of the most humble and dedicated doctors who provided almost free service to the working class. I will certainly miss him a great deal. Of course, we have also many other people who have passed on, including Prince Zulu, and many frontline workers in the fight against COVID-19 who have passed on, and the SACP pays special tribute to this contingent of workers who are in the front line against COVID-19, but especially health workers. And we want to commend that at least our comrades should take responsibility to assist the frontline workers in various provinces and districts, in hospitals, to touch base with them, work with them, assist where it's possible, combat COVID-19 together with them, and not only leave this problem to health workers and even other frontline workers. We had discussions with some of the trade unions in the sector, especially with NEHAU, and one of the critical things arising is the fact that sometimes these workers will work without PPEs, that is personal protection equipment, or sometimes would have inadequate supplies at the risk of their lives and even that of their families. And therefore, and further, they get demoralized by the looting brigade who have descended on the COVID-19 procurement. But we must pay tribute to all of these workers, and indeed continuously send our condolences to the families of those who have lost their loved ones because of COVID-19 and perhaps other diseases. But what we have seen, which we think our comrades provincial and district and branch leadership should pay attention to, is that some of the workers, particularly health workers who are in the front line, some who have lost their lives. Over 200 of the health workers have lost their lives already. It's precisely because of lack of occupational health protocols and standards by various hospitals. Lack of implementation of a compliance regime from the national core standards and even from the WHO. Terribly poor management. We have seen even when the Deputy Public Protector visited the Eastern Cape province hospitals, and she was shocked by some of the conditions she found there. And she addressed this question of poor management, for instance, and that in some instances there's been decentralized response to the pandemic. And therefore, there's not been uniformity in many instances. And this is an issue that we need to attend to at an appropriate level of the party structures. And of course, that some of the hospitals, like the one that the Deputy Public Protector visited, are not actually even complying to hygiene standards that are so imperative for a hospital, for instance. So it is quite clear that in the midst of these problems, we need to work hard to ensure we speedily implement the national health insurance and not wait until after the pandemic. So it should be a concurrent process towards the rollout of the national health insurance. So we felt it's important to just highlight these points because, comrade, this COVID-19 pandemic is devastating to our country, social life, economic life, and has created massive disruptions in our society. But of course, today on the National Women's Day, we cannot move on to deal with the core issues without reflecting at least on the program and progress made in the cause of women's liberation in our country, which obviously even our own liberation cannot be fully achieved without measuring it with how women have been liberated, how we have dealt with what Comrade Jeremy was responding to, patriarchy, for instance, within the context of fighting capitalism itself. And that in the creation of a non-sexist society, we need a strong women's movement, a strong organization on the ground that continues to elevate the woman's question as well as the gender question. And therefore, in our case, we have always faced what we call a three-pronged oppression of women. That is often racist national oppression of Black women by white minority colonial and apartheid regimes, which treated women in our country as permanent minors with no formal rights to their adulthood. And that the woman continues to suffer even today from capitalist class oppression as a worker in the predominantly capitalist South African economy. And also, women continue to suffer from the endless patriarchal and sexist oppressions and attack. This we call the triple oppression in our country. The Sandinista movement in Nicaragua called this triple struggle, where they were able to highlight the necessity that even within the movement, there must continue to be a struggle for gender equality and the struggle for gender equality in society as a whole. So this fight, it remains very important and must be continued. But we must take stock of the wonderful work of our revolutionary women, Jack Simons, one of them, Ruth First, Lillian Ngoyi, Dorota Mana, several others who have made sterling contribution to the liberation of our country. And they participated in all spheres of our society and in our revolutionary struggle, dating back from the wars of resistance, the role that women play, and to the fight against land deprivation, against the past laws, the defiance campaigns, the armed struggle, in the international fronts, in the trade unions, the mass democratic movement, and the civic organizations, and several other platforms. The women have always been available and present in any part of our struggle. For instance, we can just highlight some few achievements. There's a woman warrior, a queen, Madinoche, who was never defeated by the apartheid and the colonial regimes in any battle. They could only later on take away her queenship. The reigning Queen Mujaji, for instance, had refused to succumb to colonial regimes, and they also took away her queenship. So that's how far some of the women leaders, even in our traditional communities, have refused to succumb to colonialism. But of course, even when the colonial and apartheid regime did this, the people remained supportive of them. But most of them were humiliated and they suffered greatly. But today, despite this major achievements, particularly of production and development of material household goods, women still do a lot of unpaid domestic labor in their households. They take care of families, house chores like cooking and cleaning, looking after the sick and the elderly, and everyone in the household. And it's critical that we in the Communist Party also delves into Marxist feminism, to different strands of Marxist feminism, to engage with their philosophical outlook that deals with how this continuous system of unpaid labor of women continues to take shape and get rooted even in so-called democratic and free societies. But obviously, this is a consequence of the capitalist system itself. And therefore, a strong fight, ideological fight, becomes important. Whilst we don't have to wait for the fall of capitalism to defeat patriarchy, but we do know that patriarchy itself is an offshoot of capitalist production relations. And therefore, it's critical that we are able to change the conditions of women in our society as a concerted part of our struggle, and to improve the well-being of all of society. There's been a discussion in the Central Committee Telegram group about the response of the world leaders to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they've put a comparison of 5 leaders, men leaders, and 5 women leaders. And you can see in those countries led by women, the approach to handling the pandemic is just amazing. And the impact they're making in their societies, it's something else. It's so wonderful. So this is a big issue that I think must occupy strategic center space in the work of the Communist Party. But on the state-owned enterprises, which is my primary task here today, I just want to raise some few ideas. Some of these are not necessarily your party positions, but perhaps will be in the same broad framework. Because if we are to drive an economic development in an underdeveloped country, you cannot rely on the capitalist economy to drive your development. Let me just indicate that a comparative brief about when I grew up, maybe my early consciousness. I was in a township with a tar road and a running water, but a bucket toilet system. So my earliest memories is when me and my friends were making carts, small cars to drive around on the tar road. And later on, almost several decades later, I found that the concept of freedom for the people there in that street would have required, for instance, electrification of their houses. In other areas, the most immediate thing for the people was water. So in my street, we had no problem of water. We had water. So the people's concept of freedom continues to change. And even in our case today, those in the urban centers, their sense of arrival to concept of freedom sometimes differs with those in the rural areas, who still don't have tarred roads or not even have a permanent source of clean water. So it becomes critical that state-owned entities are geared towards development rather than collecting revenue for the state. Of course, important as that is, because it's also important to say state-owned entities, they must be sustainable in themselves. It should not be that because they are state-owned entities, there will be a continuous bailout and so forth, but they must be sustainable. And one can show some of the state-owned entities that are in the top 500 or even top 100 companies in the world, state corporations that are doing well run, generating massive revenues for their respective countries. So in our case as well, we must have that capacity. But for us to have this, we need perhaps to highlight some few points. One is that we need to elevate the question of the right to work of all South Africans and the people in South Africa who qualified in this basis of the right to work campaign. So meaning that affirmation of work becomes an important social security of all our people. So if you place that in the forefront, even your state-owned entities and their role begin to change to respond to the general thrust of social security of the people, as well as development of our economy. And therefore, we must indicate that, particularly given the devastation of COVID-19 to our economy, which we are quite conscious about, it is important that we appreciate that the role, the possibility to generate a new economy or develop a new economy post-COVID-19, which should not only wait mechanically post-COVID-19, could start now with a number of interventions and processes to make it possible post-COVID-19 to anchor a new economy, so that we don't go to what the Communist Party is characterized as a crisis before the crisis. So we don't go back to the capitalist economic crisis before capitalist-induced COVID-19 crisis. Because COVID-19 itself an outcome of the rampant capitalist destruction of nature and the environment and the ecology in seeking profits. And I remember Comrade Jeremy has written extensively on this some years ago, almost not prophetic as such, but understanding that capitalism in its form of warpath, of profit making, doesn't care about sustainability. And we basically said there will be more pandemics. Even Bill Gates appreciate this point that at the current rate of capitalist development, there will be more and more pandemics. And these pandemics will affect everyone, rich or poor. So therefore, we need, in the context of COVID-19 and also appreciating the possibility of post-COVID-19, begin to fight a new economic trajectory, to fight for a new economic trajectory, whilst at the same time fighting against an entrenching neoliberal economic trajectory that is actually being imposed not only in South Africa, but in the continent and the world at large, particularly in developing countries. You would have noticed that the IMF, for instance, made available $1 trillion to borrow to developing countries for COVID-19 related diseases or responses. And I've seen a report from some European research organization indicating that many developing countries will not even be able to meet their obligations for this COVID-19 relief funds. Despite that, when they came, this came at possibilities of low interest rate payments. So this becomes one big issue that we must elevate in our struggles. But to do that, one will start by saying, we need to also turn around, firstly, the role of the South African Reserve Bank in the broader scheme of economic development. Last week, or a couple of weeks ago, Indonesia became one of the first developing countries, for instance, to implement what we call modern monetary theory, wherein they effectively utilizes the role of the Reserve Bank in their respective countries to intervene in economic development, not just about buying bonds, but doing much more than that. In essence, of course, the whole world was watching on them because it's the first time that a country became so bold to embrace how to respond to their own economic challenges from a financial position. But it is critical to understand that at the core of many interventions is the necessity for resources or money. And that the banks and the banking system in many countries have to play a particular role in the creation of wealth in their respective countries. The same should happen in our case. We have called, as a Communist Party, for some of the development finance institutions, like the DBSA, the IDC, and so forth, to have a direct link or banking licenses and offer loans, because what they do is that they offer loans to other people, but they also loan from the banks. So they loan from the banks, pay interest to the commercial banks, and then loan to me, who wants to develop a business or an industry. Whereas they can actually go directly to the Reserve Bank. That's what we have been calling for. But more than that, we need the creation of more public banks. The banks are able to create money. And I think this is very, very important. Any democratic government would have to understand this. When I was checking, for instance, and Comrade can go and look into this, the top 100 companies and the top 500 companies, the global Forbes Global 500 companies, for instance, and looking at the finance sector and its domination there, that in the top 12 of the Chinese companies there, 4 of them are banks, whether it's Industrial Development Bank, Construction Bank, Agriculture Bank, and many others. The same in Europe. KfW, for instance, in Germany, it's fully owned by the German government. It's a massive bank, third largest bank in Germany. Germany is the single biggest economy in Europe. And that same bank, KfW, has got a major stake in another bank called Commerzbank, which is the second biggest bank in Germany. And some of these banks are actually even multinational banks. So money creation by states becomes important through the financial sector, so that the state doesn't have to only look into the private capital for rescue every time it's in crisis. So this is critical, but it's suffice to also say, maybe as a point of emphasis, that in Germany, for instance, you have no less than 1,400 public banks across different levels, national level, provincial level, municipal levels, public banks. And they are able to anchor aspects of development in their respective countries. And we have seen, for instance, even in other so-called developed countries, even in the US, what used to be, I mean, in Britain, what used to be called the Royal Bank of Scotland is now under one group, wholly owned by the state. So the very same capitalist countries that are professing private financial markets, private banks, and financial institutions are themselves owning these institutions. And those institutions are all over. This KfW, for instance, is in different countries and continents, continues to borrow money and create more wealth. So it is critical that we appreciate the role of state-owned entities and companies in their broadness and the possibility for them to make a huge impact in the development of a country. So in other words, for this section of the financial sector, we may need what we call tailor-made sectoral banks as well. Maybe the first one, you can also have a rural women's bank, and even a women's bank, sectoral, so they can have an understanding of the sector that they are dealing with and avail resources in that regard to deal with these matters, cooperative banks and so forth. Even the US, for instance, is one of the biggest cooperative banks that belongs to communities, and is differentiated from the general commercial banks in terms of the loan structure and the support to SMMEs and so forth. They also have in the US a farmers bank. Not if you raise this thing, for instance, people will tell you about the land bank, which doesn't have the same modeling as in those in the US, for instance. So even the land bank should be able to have a direct license, but operate much more differently in a developmental form. I think the other key issue that we have not paid attention to in the financial sector particularly, it's also this question of asset management. You may need to consolidate some of those and build a strong asset management bank, not only in the context of our PIC, which is for public sector workers, but a broad asset management industry in a bankable form, so that the crisis that we have, why, for instance, we go and borrow up to 70 billion or between 70 and 90 billion, 100 billion, depending on the interest rates from the IMF, when actually we have over 12 trillion rands in provident and retirement funds in the country, for instance. We can't borrow from that. Pension and retirement funds. So we were actually creating a license and a link, a direct link with the IMF and the World Bank, which was unnecessary. Because in any case, in this country, every 8 weeks, we borrow the same amount from the capital markets. So there was no need for us to go there. So there was no crisis. But it's imposed to us in the midst of a crisis, so that if you argue against it, you seem to be arguing against interventions to fight COVID-19, when actually it was not the case. I can tell you, Comrade JC, we hear that the World Bank, when they received the first application from South Africa, they organized a cocktail party to celebrate that South Africa has come on board. But not only did they just celebrate that South Africa has come on board, they knew that when South Africa comes on board, it will drag the entire African continent with. And the fight against imperialism becomes much more steeper once you are much more attached with these countries. So therefore, the role of public institutions becomes very critical. That's also important to the extent that these institutions in our communities must also be protected. So the Communist Party has to roll out a continuous strong program to defend public property in our communities. How is it possible that we have so many schools destroyed, over 200 schools destroyed in few months in one country? It's unheard of. So we can't call for public institutions when on the one hand, we participate, we allow our communities where we stay to go on and destroy these institutions. And there's no concomitant action against it from within our structures. So we need a campaign in this regard to defend public institutions. I think it's also critical, Comrade, to highlight that the repurposing of SOEs to achieve targeted developmental mandates will become important. Just to share some ideas about what other countries have been doing. For instance, China have got a comprehensive SOE strategy. One of their strategies is that their SOEs are straddling across the length and breadth of Chinese society. In our case, if you check many of the SOEs, particularly the national one, are based in Johannesburg and Pretoria, or they are headquartered there. In China, for instance, they will take an institution like ESCOM and take it to a rural area, far-flung rural area, and say, here's your land, put your headquarters here, but supply the rest of the country. So they also have a mandate to develop that particular locality where they are based, given their capacity and the resource base that they have. So that's one area that in our repurposing of SOEs, we must make sure that they're able to straddle across the country. Again, we may need to relook into some of the things that we felt were no longer important because of neoliberalization of our economy in South Africa, for instance. For instance, we may need to look into where is our bigger spending and where is our bigger necessity of needs. Water, for instance. We have left this to municipal water boards, and they've been incapable to deliver water to all parts of the country. We may need the state involvement in this regard, whether in the construction of dams and other things. But I must also indicate that, you know, I mean, as the country, the continent's leading industrial country, South Africa, I still don't understand, and I might need to be educated on this, I still don't understand why a country with more than 3,000 coastline can simply say it's a water scarce society just because the inland doesn't receive enough rain. I still don't understand that. And we go and transport hydropower from other parts of the country or of the continent. When we have a running sea with waves every day, electricity generated from motion. What is this industrialization that we're talking about if we can't intervene on permanent solutions to some of the basic things, whether it's the necessity for the supply of energy, clean hydro energy, waves energy, and other things. But the bigger issue is that we need to build more dams, for instance. I passed one day going to Northern Cape. I passed from the Northern Cape side going to Colesberg. I passed the Orange River, 200 kilometers before the coastline. And I asked Comrade Shushu whether there's a dam between that stretch to the sea. He said there was none. The only dam, the last one was Harib. I mean, how do you leave such a massive river throwing fresh water into the sea over a 200 kilometer stretch? So we need state interventions in this kind of areas to provide water security for our people. And therefore, the role of SOEs in this regard, when we repurpose some of our SOEs, we need to relook into how they can respond to the general basic needs of our communities, particularly in the context of what COVID-19 has exposed, lack of water in our communities. One other issue, for instance, that we may need to look into is the digital technology and industrial use of digital economy. Coordinated comprehensively through a major state intervention, not some small agencies that exist in different institutions, universities, CSIR, and so forth, but a state investment in understanding that the world is developing into a digital economy. And in fact, some research from Australia was indicating that in the next 50 years, for instance, not 50 years, that the next generation will have to learn 50% of new jobs. Basically, they were also saying that the next 50% of jobs are unknown today. There will be a consequence of digital innovation and digital industries. We are far lagging behind in this regard, not enough investment in this case. But There are some very wonderful interventions from some of the African continents. For instance, Rwanda has been leading in this regard, including recently on the COVID crisis. Their development of robotics have been amazing, and their use of automation in difficult areas, for instance, where frontline workers cannot be able to touch people with COVID-19 and so forth. They are able to send robots to check their blood pressure and everything else, the basics, temperature and so forth, drop medicine and everything else. So they've been doing some of those things, but our universities may need to coordinate themselves much more stronger. And therefore, as a country, as we embark on this digital technology and industrial use, we may also need to repurpose an SOE in this field. But doing so will also require to invest in satellite technology, for instance. And it's cheaper to do it these days. And that's a cheaper form of communication and availability of data. That is why one of the issues we should also fight for is free data in the country, instead of going to sell our spectrum. And all the time, we use a leeway that we have no capacity. And yet, when we are faced with a disaster, we are able to release over 200 billion for the management by big capital, the capitalist bank, to provide as a security to private capital. And yet, we can't invest to lower the cost of production in this country, the cost of communication through interventions such as interventions in data, for instance, and digital technology. Actually, the appropriate use of big data, technology, digitization, innovation, and its impactful use, which we have completely neglected. There are snippets of this and that. For instance, University of Johannesburg is doing great in this regard, thanks to particularly Professor Mapaila, who's one of the leading artificial intelligence specialists in the world. But we can coordinate this and not just have institutions. I know it's in the advisory body advising our government in this regard, but we need a broad strategic thrust and impactful use of technology today. We've been seeing, for instance, how our the borders have opened up across the country, illegal trades taking place and so forth, and that there's not enough personnel to monitor that, when actually we can use technology to do that. So it's those and many other things that I think that we may need to look into. Lastly, Comrade Chair, it's also to say in the field of technology, to look into cybersecurity industry and its regulation. Not just some division in the state security agents that deals with cybersecurity. Because as we now move completely into this space, even of digital banking and communication, cybersecurity becomes critical. So we need to create new institutions that will look into enable our economy to participate both in the world economy, but also to meet the social needs of our country. We understand, of course, that the world economy is quite fragile at the moment. It's too sensitive even to small shocks, whether it's market tremors and so forth, or what Trump says, it shakes up and so forth. The rand value, it's lost all the time. And one of the things that, for instance, we may need to think about out of the box, this is, for instance, one of the issues that has not been discussed in the Communist Party, is the issue, for instance, to have a digital currency, not only for South Africa, but for the continent. Why do we allow everyone else to create their own digital currencies and so forth? And people have been transacting on those. But here, the formal banking sector hates digital currencies because of their ability to erode into them. But we can have state institutions leading in this. There's blockchain technology that is able to make it easier to do that. So it's not something that is out of this world. It's been done in other areas. For instance, other big corporations are beginning to do it. Even Facebook is beginning to have its own digital currency. I think they call it the lira or something. So our government can't be so archaic and not create alternative institutions concomitant with the current realities that is in this field of digital economy and so forth. So the others, for instance, which are just shocking, the oil industry in this country, we rely completely on it. Apartheid regime at Sasol, we decreased our percentages in Sasol. We use this every single day. We have Petro SA, almost useless as an entity. We need to repurpose it. We need to have availability of petrol from a state institution. We need to bring more, if you like, competition in that regard, not from a IMF point of view, in a sense that at the moment, the state role is almost non-existent except as a regulator. When actually we can lower prices if we intervene strategically. We can even, Hugo Chavez, for instance, from Venezuela, at one point, he gave South Africa an oil block for exploration and development. We've never taken that. So it is this kind of things that we are too tardy to do certain things. We need to develop a car industry where we develop cars here, but because of the licensing procedures, we can't even think of developing our own car when we have the capability to do it. So it is all of these things that are important, that we need in the rebuilding of our economy to think about perhaps new state-owned entities that will be much more critical in the different spheres of major impactful investment in our society. My last point, Comrade Chair, is just to say that there's a political question to how we are using state funds as a movement. That this question cannot be left unattended to. One is that we're witnessing across the continent and perhaps even elsewhere, where revolutionary movements are losing revolutionary morality. They are losing integrity, mass support, and some are subsequently losing political power. At the rate of our behavior here, we are going through the same path. And largely these are generated and become visible soon after attainment of political power, because revolutionaries enter into government, maintain the colonial system of oppressors, never change anything or never change the fundamentals, but focus on the non-fundamentals and leave intact the system of private property accumulation. And they start accumulating. And themselves, they even accumulate primitively. So in that regard, they breed corruption. They get consumed by corruption and greed, which is in our case, for instance, permitted through our ranks. So we need to continue to respond to this question, because failure to act decisively by our movement, we will soon pay a heavy price as a country. At the same time, that is why if we fail to act, the entire state system will be criminalized by public opinion. So it's important that we act decisively and constantly and never tire to act against corruption. So it is in this regard that the Communist Party must continue to raise its voice. And where we have communist leaders in different spheres of government, they must act decisively. We must commend Comrade Kolile Ngata in the Eastern Cape as MEC of Cocta, who has been acting against corruption in different municipalities decisively, and that must be commended. And perhaps in other areas where comrades are doing so, if we know about it, we should be able to elevate those kind of interventions in our country. Because failure to do so, comrade, we have seen now that the criminal enterprise has become comfortable inside the state system. And we can't allow that as a revolution. That is why it's so critical that we act and act decisively against any form of wrongdoing. I will leave it there, Comrade Chair, and just indicate that the former finance minister of Greece, who once wrote a book, a very important book, Varoufakis, about austerity measures, had then raised something fundamental that we may need to appreciate as a revolution. That sometimes we've been basically saying the financialization of the world economy is the main source of part of the crisis. And that actually we have forgotten to talk about the neoliberalization of the economy. That has created what you call the minotaur, that ho-ho, or the big monster, the human body monster with the bull face. That ho-ho was created, it says, because of neoliberalism, when state began to sell almost everything that they have. There's no one that says we can't review what we have and how it is useful at a particular point in time. But wholesale selling of state institutions is not the option. And in fact, he has written extensively in this regard. Comrades, if they can get some of his books to read, he explains these things in quite strong details. But that is Yanis Varoufakis, who wrote in his book, The Global Minotaur. And I think he traces all of these things from the Great Depression up to now about what's happening with the world economy. So we may need to look into that in the context of South African economy, but also to read about China's own SOE interventions that have anchored China's fast development as a country. They may have done certain things, sold this and that institutions and so forth, but at the core, they've retained state ownership and made them global. And they are run professionally. They are able to generate good revenues and so forth. I was looking at some of the statistics of the monies that this SOEs, particularly in the top 500, global top 500 companies that they made. Just in 2019, for instance, they made a profit of 2.5 trillion. And their total revenue was at 32 billion trillion US dollars. Even this 2.5 trillion is in profit, is of US dollars. This is massive, massive money. The African continent doesn't even have $1 trillion US dollars. This is how serious this question is of underdevelopment in our own context. And when we look at them, they are using state-owned entities. We used to call them, and we should still, the commanding heights of the economy. Without them, the economy collapses. But with them, the economy goes on. Like in our case, institutions like ESCOM, for instance. It's at the core of economic survivors. Thank you very much, Comrade Jeremy. My apologies for taking much bit long. I got agitated with some of the statistics as I was going through this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Comrade Solly. No, I think we all appreciate the passion with which you always speak about many things, including about corruption, but also the critical role of the state. What we will do is we'll take, if comrades can, as we normally